All right, so let's want to be cognizant of everybody's time, and we've got bunches of reports. So shall we start our finance committee meeting? If we could have a roll call, please.
Trustee Rubin.
Here.
Trustee Hallwax.
Here.
Trustee Mealopoulos.
Here.
Do we have to do anything to note?
I was just going to say, we do have a physical quorum present. Trustee Hallwax is traveling for work purposes, and so he, in compliance with the village's policy on remote attendance, would qualify. It is helpful, though, that those that are on the committee that are in attendance agree that he can participate remotely.
Agreed.
Okay,
Both of us agree. All right.
you're in, Joe.
And at this point, is there anyone that would like to make a comment about anything that's not anticipated to be discussed on the agenda? Looking and hearing none, seeing none and hearing none, then let's move on.
We have minutes that we need
Oh, excuse me.
to approve first.
I forgot.
problem.
Can I get a motion to approve the minutes that were in the package from last month?
Motion approved.
All right, all those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Which we didn't get a second, but I guess.
We got two motions, so we're good. We're good.
I'll get the hang of this.
We've got it. We're doing just fine.
All right, minutes are approved. Thank you.
You got it.
All right,
Now we're at monthly financial report.
and now.
Keep going. Okay, so tonight's agenda, we'll go over the May treasurer's report. I will go through this rather quickly because we do have a rather full agenda. We'll go through the monthly CIP updates. We do have the calendar year 22 audit presentation, actuarial report presentation, then we'll wrap everything up with a discussion on our donation policy. Okay, so heading into the May treasurer's report, included in the packet, our property taxes remain higher than prior year. We remain strong there, which is good news. We're at 68.9% of budget, so we'll draw on those revenues until we get the second installment this year. Just a reminder, we do still believe that that's going to be received late. So we'll share more information as we get it there. When I back out on a cash basis, back out those large receipts that we received in January that are really for last year, we're projecting to end this year above budgetary targets by about $26,000, which is a great place to be in. On the sales tax side, this month's receipt was less than where we were at last year, but it's higher than what we were projecting for this month's budget, and also projecting out for the rest of the year. We're projecting a surplus as high as $264,000 over what we were budgeting for the year. So sales taxes continue to come in strong. It's a good news story. And this was a great month for revenue. Places for eating tax, our building permits, telecom, cable franchise, use tax, garbage fees, ambulance fees, and parking fees all came up above budgetary targets for the month and this month last year as well. So May was a great month for revenue. On the expenditure side, we are within budgetary expectations. We're higher than last year, but only at about 39% of budget. So we're tracking with where we would expect to be at this point during the year. On the water fund side, I'm sad to see it raining today because I'm sure Stella is too. The drought was good to us in many ways. So the water fund saw a large surge in revenue in May due to the drought-like conditions. We really saw irrigation pick up. So that helped revenue quite a bit. That volumetric charge was higher. It's higher than this time last year. We're tracking with where we should be in terms of budget, and we're about $100,000 more in revenue this year than we were last year, year to date. On the fixed charge revenue side, we're right where we expect to be. If everything continues as is, we'll end the year about $9,000 over budget on the fixed charge side. And then expenditures in the water fund are higher than last year, but that's largely due to all the capital activity that you see going on. And we're right in line with where we expect to be in terms of budgetary targets.
If I can just throw a PSA in there relative to water, it's an interesting opportunity if you haven't availed yourself of it yet. I signed up to receive text messages from our metering system. If you'll recall that our new AMI meters are real time. And every 24 hours, it aggregates your water usage. And if you set a threshold, it will alert you when you have surpassed that threshold. I surpassed that threshold every day for about 2 weeks because of irrigation and things like that. So it's actually a really helpful tool, and we've been trying to get the community to use it. So I just encourage people to
And they would sign up for that by going on the website?
yeah, and we'll push that out again through e-news and a few other means of getting people to sign up for it. But it's really a cool tool.
And the village thanks you for helping the water fund. Okay. All right, so moving on to the golf fund, I don't want to steal Stella's thunder here, so I'll just briefly note golf revenues at 31% for the year, about $250,000 higher than this point last year. Strong revenue performance in greens fees in particular. So overall, good month for the golf club as well. And I'll let Stella talk a little bit more about operations and what's going on.
Yes, I do love a drought. Dave Arden, our superintendent, does not. We usually average 4.39 inches of rain. We had 0.5. So that results in us allowing carts to run every single day of the month, which is a huge revenue generator. We made $67,000, $3,000 over budget in that category. Very unusual for May. It does create a lot of issues for the golf course. We are always trying to conserve water anyway. We don't water our rough as a rule. But because we have not had any rainfall that has kind of turned off color, it will come back probably right after this rainfall. But there have been a lot of dry areas on the greens and tees, which result in having to do a lot of hand watering. We have purchased a new range ball dispenser. We needed one, but we're also looking to the future when we potentially will be a full use range. So the range dispenser itself will in the future be able to take credit cards, so you can go right to the range. You don't have to come to the pro shop. We've eliminated the use of tokens that we used to hand out coins and hand out keys. We've eliminated those. Everything's with a PIN system. And one of the best features for me is there's tracking now. So everyone that purchases like a range membership, we're getting their email and their zip code, so we can target that market separately. Before, we never had any access to any of that data. It has automatic closing times on it, so we don't have to worry about staff opening or closing the machine either. Endless reports about how many balls are dispensed by the hour, by the day, which will help with our staffing too. So it's a good investment, and it'll help us even when we expand to the full use range. Friends of the Glencoe Golf Club subcommittees have been formed for events, and they've taken on 3 events for this year. First one is going to be the grand opening of the Croquet Club, which they're looking at a date in August for that. A big party and everyone wearing whites and having a little jazz band, so we're excited about that. That's a new event for us. Or another one will be a stargazing event that, we are so located in the dark of the village that is perfect for stargazing. So they're looking to see what's coming up, and they're gonna organize an event for families, everyone to come to the golf course after dark and come and take a peek. And then they want an all Glencoe meeting to talk about how the future golf clubhouse can be used by different organizations. So the library club, the schools, the park district, every different, Friends of the Green Bay Trail, what might you want to plan there in 2 or 3 years? How can we help? How could we think about doing good planning? So they've got a lot of good events planned this year. That's it.
Thank you, Stella. Moving on to the rest of the village funds, the debt service, motor fuel tax fund, and the capital projects fund all have rather minimal activity despite the fact that our capital projects are well underway. We do see a delay in those expenditures hitting from the time that the construction actually happens. But all of those expenditures are as expected within budgetary targets, not much to write home about there. On a personnel level, no surprise to anyone, our overtime remains elevated with the vacancies that we have, particularly in public safety. But we are starting to see full-time salary expense and pension contribution increase. Those are as planned. Our pension contributions increase naturally with the property tax installments. So we do see a large influx in the front half of the year. All of those contributions that belong to the pension fund are expensed. And then we'll see that again with the second installment later this year. On a full-time salary side, obviously, as we fill our vacancies, we're seeing that climb as well. And just a reminder to the committee, we did budget for all of our vacant positions to ensure that as we fill them, we can cover that expense. So we'll continue that practice going forward, but we are starting to see the climb.
Sorry to interrupt, quick question. The funding of the public safety pension, do we do that just when the taxes come in, assuming they come in, or do we do that monthly on a steady basis and then reimburse ourselves?
We do it both ways. So the county, there is a requirement that the levy that is specific to police pension must go directly to the pension fund. So as property tax bills are paid, the portion that belongs to the police pension fund is directed directly into their bank account. So there's a lot of fluctuation in that portion of our contribution. The amount of the required contribution that exceeds what we can levy, because we're capped, that comes out of the general fund, and we try to make our best guess of how much we have to contribute. We divide that by 12 and we contribute that on a monthly basis. So we do both. And then at the end of the year, we do kind of a true up just to make sure that we meet that required contribution.
So when we get contributions this year that should have come in last year, when we get money that's earmarked for that this year that should have come in last year, and we had to front those funds, which we did, what mechanism do we use to reimburse ourselves?
So though it was just a bank transfer, and we did already reimburse ourselves for that.
So we're allowed to do that because we fronted it?
Correct.
Okay.
And that is well documented in both the finance committee minutes and also the police pension board minutes that we kind of came to that agreement that they would get that money up front. Great question. Getting too far ahead of myself. Okay, moving on to projections in a big picture perspective, just looking at revenues. If we look at the cash flow projections part of the report, we are on target to end the general fund is on target to end the year at a $2.4 million surplus over revenue. Let's see, how do I say that? Over revenue budget. That's on a cash basis. When I back out that large receipt in January, or those large receipts in January, will exceed our revenue budget by $744,000 if everything kind of goes as we expect for the rest of the year. So we're running high on revenues, which is a good news story. Same thing on the water fund, and I would expect this number to grow if we do continue to have dry conditions this summer. But we are projecting a $33,000 receipt of revenue over budget in the water fund alone. When we add expenditures into that picture and we take what we're projecting for the general fund in terms of revenues and what we're projecting for expenditures, right now the cash flow projections on a cash basis show a surplus of $620,000 to the general fund. When I back out those property taxes and we talk about things on an accrual basis, we're at a drawdown of about $1.1 million, which is what we planned for this year's budget.
Right.
So we're really right on target with where we should be in terms of the general fund. The water fund is projecting a surplus of 2.1 million, which we're all very excited. On Thursday morning, we'll be watching the bond sale. So that surplus is entirely related to that planned sale. Fund reserves are very strong right now. The general fund's at 74% and the water fund's at 54.8%. That's not unusual for this time of year. We just got a large influx of cash from all of our property tax revenue. We'll draw down on that and that number will come down before the second installment's received. And then just one more note on inflationary impacts. Both our commodities and our contractual services, village-wide and all funds, are higher than last year. Commodities are a little outside of the range of where we were expecting in terms of budget. Some of that's timing, some of it is that we are really just seeing that things are costing more. Same thing on the contractual services side. We're seeing that the upward pressure on wages in the market is negatively impacting the prices that we're paying on some of the services that we are receiving. So that's something that we're really watching on a staff level very closely, keeping an eye on individual line item budgets to make sure if we're exceeding somewhere that we're cutting somewhere else. And it's also something that we're really going to have to think about as we prepare the 2024 budget, which we'll be talking about with the Finance Committee very soon, kind of kicking off that process. So nothing to be concerned about at this point, but it is something that we're really diligently monitoring right now. Everyone's favorite topic, vehicle and equipment updates. We still have one mystery squad car out in the ether. No ETA on that. We're not sure if we'll get it or not, but it is on order. We have magically produced a leaf vacuum that we didn't think we were going to get until this fall, so that is ready for delivery. So we should be taking possession of that soon. And as far as we know, our aerial truck and the dump body that were planned in this year's budget are on track for what we were anticipating originally. So third quarter of 23 for the truck, and then this month or next month for the dump body. So good news overall. Questions on the treasurer's report? Okay. All right. I will hand this over to Margaret to chat about our CIP update.
Good evening. Your schedules can be found in your packet for the June update on pages 49 and 50 and the quarterly updates on page 51. As you can see from our slide, there's been a lot of items that have been moved to August for the board's approval. That includes the roll call training room renovation, the village hall space needs analysis, the second floor public safety renovation, a street light improvement project, and the 16-inch water main valve replacement. So all those items you'll see in August. The Village Hall entrances renovation project and the replacement of the roof sections of the Village Hall and Public Works Garage are going to be brought before the board for approval in July. And it is possible that the garage portion of the roof may be deferred due to the need to replace some heating units, and Director Bob can speak to that if you have questions. We did receive another patrol car back in May, so that was good news. We have the one that's outstanding still, like Nikki mentioned. And then the traffic signal controller modifications project is on the village board agenda for approval this month. So that's really good news. And staff's available if you have any questions this evening.
What's the heating issue? These are the large air handling units in the garage up in the ceiling area of the garage. We have two of them. They've served their life and they're down. So we've got to have something ready for the winter, so that'll probably take priority over the planned roof. And the roof replacement in the garage can be deferred. Okay.
Right over.
Questions? No? I think got a bunch of notes, I
I
think.
might have to go back. Can I go back to it?
Sure, of course.
It's the standpoint, I'm just curious, on page 18.
Yes.
We have our revenue, summary towards the top, we have our expense summary towards the middle. Just so I can understand, so kind of really new here. When you're looking at the current total budget, totals towards the bottom, it's like there's a deficit of almost 5 million. Is that something we make up over time or explain?
So it depends, it's hard to look at it in aggregate versus the individual funds. And when we do the budget process, we have a chart that shows by fund how much we're spending down fund reserve versus how much is covered in operating revenues and expenditures. So the village has a balanced budget policy that we require our operating expenditures to be covered by our operating revenues. Anything above and beyond that must be for one-time capital expenditures. The largest thing that's driving this expense is the capital projects fund. That 3.7 million, you can see that that's drawing down on only 15 million or 15,000 in revenue. When we issue bonds, we deposit all of the bond proceeds either in the water fund, if it's water bonds, or we put it in the capital projects fund. And that entire fund balance is designated for capital project and it's meant to be drawn down to zero. In reality, that never happens just because of timing. So that capital projects fund budget is almost always a deficit. The water fund also can sometimes run a deficit depending on if we're deliberately spending down that fund balance for capital. And then typically every year we decide on a number in the general fund that we're gonna draw down for capital as well. So that number this year was like 1.1 million in the general fund. And then also the remainder of that, I think, is the capital projects fund. So that we're about 4.6 between the two of those. And the rest of it might just be timing, but.
Good question.
Yeah, great question. Anything else before? Okay.
I'll encourage you to ask all of them.
Great question. Okay, so moving on to the 2022 annual comprehensive financial report. So included in the packet this evening and in front of you all, you have printed copies if you'd like, is the 2022 comprehensive financial report, commonly referred to now as the ACFR, not the CAFR. We've learned changing acronyms here. So just a little background on this report. This is the village's annual audit. We start the process at the beginning of the fiscal year for the prior fiscal year. So we have a planning meeting in January. We have preliminary field work where the auditors come out and they test our internal controls, take a look at our preliminary financials. And then we completed final field work just at the end of February, early March. And that was just kind of a combination of hybrid in-person work where the auditors were actually here, and then also a little bit of remote work. Including or following that field work, we worked with the auditors through the draft of the financial report. And then that process kind of concludes in June and July with all of our required reporting. So there's a series of financial reports that we have to file based off of the final results of this, including providing copies to our ratings agency, but also completing all of the reports that are required by the state of Illinois, and also filing reports with what's called EMA, but it's our continuing disclosure because we have outstanding bonds. We do have to provide additional financial information to our bondholders as well. The audit team, I'd like to introduce Jamie Wilkie. She's sitting next to me. Jamie is the partner on our audit from Lauterbach and Amon. Don Shaw's not here this evening, but he was the principal on our audit, and then you can see our staff team. We also work with Lauterbach on our Illinois Division of Insurance reporting. It's a very detailed report on both of our pension funds. It has a bunch of census data in there. The actuarial valuation is dependent on a lot of that. But this is our team and great experience again this year, like always. So I'm going to hand it over to Jamie for the formal presentation of the audit. We'll review this today, answer any questions that you have. But then we'll also have a formal presentation on Thursday night where the village board will accept it. Great. Well, thank you. I certainly want to take the opportunity this evening to thank Nikki and her team. So certainly a coordinated effort with the folks from our office to be able to get through this process. It is really 6 months from start to finish, really a lot of coordinated effort back and forth. We always come into a well-prepared audit. Certainly staff is attentive and easy to work with, so we certainly appreciate all of their efforts. So I know most of you are sitting in the room, so thank you. This evening, I will provide just a brief overview of the audit results. We'll kind of take a look at a few key areas within the document. I'll provide some page number references as we go. And then certainly we can open it up for any questions. I'll try to stay out of the weeds of the numbers. That's really not my goal this evening, but to really talk about kind of overall results and trends that we're seeing. So we'll start with the lovely document with the beautiful picture on the front, and we'll start on pages 10 and 11 and 12, which really provides the independent auditor's opinion. Obviously, in my opinion, the most important part of the document, and it's certainly why you all engage us. We did issue for the December 31st, 2022 audit, what we call an unmodified or clean opinion. So current Illinois state statute does require that the village undertake an independent audit within 6 months of the close of the fiscal year. As part of that process, we are attempting to ensure that the financial statements are materially correct, meaning that all of the numbers and disclosures that Nikki and her team have provided are in fact materially accurate. That is indicated by that unmodified or clean opinion, which is the highest level opinion that the village can receive. As part of that process each year, and as you go through the 3 pages of the independent auditor's opinion, you'll also find discussion related to internal controls. So while the audit is not intended to provide a specific opinion about internal controls, as Nikki indicated, we do still undertake a significant amount of internal control related testing, documentation. We are looking each year at process, procedures, segregation of duties, workflow, et cetera, to make sure that we're comfortable with the control environment. Certainly, if there were any findings, areas of concern, we would have to communicate those this evening, and we're happy to report we had no such findings. So truly a clean audit opinion. Immediately after the opinion, you'll find a section labeled Management's Discussion and Analysis, or how we refer to it as MD&A. This section provides 14 pages. As the title indicates, it is prepared by management. So we do review all of the numbers and disclosures within this section of the report. But pages 14 through 27 really do provide the executive summary. Your audit probably 15 years ago was half this size. Unfortunately, we have constant new standards to address that inevitably have added endless pages to any local government audit. So that MD&A section, in my opinion, has become really important to try to actually digest what is going on. So I would encourage you to read that section in detail. I actually think you'll find some very similar trends to where you guys are right now in the current year. The general fund did have positive operating results, and that's discussed in more detail. The enterprise fund also had very positive results, and again, that's discussed in detail. So kind of mirrored trends a little bit to what Nikki just covered in the current financial results. You'll also find information related to the village's long-term debt, capital asset investments throughout the year, and the overall discussion of trends and kind of comparables to the prior fiscal year. Again, happy to answer any specific number questions, but I wasn't going to go through those in detail tonight. The financial statements themselves then start on page 30 of the document. We have several sets of financials. I'll just briefly kind of explain each one and maybe some high-level results. So page 30 and 31 provides what we call our statement of net position. This statement is basically a balance sheet that includes all of the village's funds, kind of condensed into one schedule, and all reported under full accrual methodology. meaning we are taking into account long-term assets such as capital assets, as well as any long-term debt such as bonds, pension obligations, et cetera. So this is really kind of viewed as a one snapshot of the village's results for the fiscal year. And you'll see on the bottom of page 31, when we take into account both the governmental activities, which is all your non-enterprise funds, and your business type activities, we end the year with total equity just north of $70 million for the village, which is up from the prior fiscal year. Page 32 and 33 is what we call our statement of activities. This, in theory, is the same concept, all funds for the village, all under full accrual reporting. And this really is the income statement. It is a wonky looking income statement, I will tell you that. But overall, if you take a look at the bottom of page 33, you should see a number of $2,507,897. That, at a very high level, is the overall increase in the village's total equity for the fiscal year for all funds. The detail of all of your operating funds is really provided after those two statements. I wasn't going to go through them in detail. I think I indicated there's some very similar trends as Nikki was just discussing current results. So we're going to flip a good handful of pages all the way to page 145. Like I said, there's a lot that GASB has added over the years, so we can certainly back up and discuss some of those sections. And certainly, Nikki, if there's anywhere in between you want me to point out. But starting on page 145 is what we call our statistical section. I point this out because it is a required section of the audit as part of the Government Finance Officers Association award that they have for the Certificate of Achievement in Excellence, the Certificate of Achievement for Excellence in Financial Reporting. The village participates in this award program, and you did receive the award for the prior fiscal year. I always point this out because the back half of this document, and this section in particular, has enormous amounts of historical information, really condensed within kind of a digestible number of pages. So if you're looking for 10-year trend information for the village, you're going to find all kinds of 10-year trend information starting at page 145 and taking you all the way through the last page of the document. There will be information on financial trends, property tax history, long-term debt history, operating indicators. As I indicated, really a wealth of information at the back of the report. As part of the audit, we do issue a couple of other formal letters to the village. The first is what we call our management letter. That's really our opportunity each year to provide any information on upcoming standards changes. That was really the nature of this year. Unfortunately, GASB, or the Governmental Accounting Standards Board, is continually coming out with new standards. Many of them recently have been fairly cumbersome, I will say. So next year, we will be working with Nikki and the team on what we call GASB 96. GASB 96 target is information technology subscriptions. So anything that the village is paying a subscription fee for, we are going to have to analyze those contracts and potentially measure them a little differently and disclose them a little differently. So it is a rather large statement, probably one of the bigger ones more recently. So we've already put out some education, some templates, some resources for our clients to be able to start tackling that. GASB 94 will also be applicable for next year. Hopefully some minimal impact for you guys. I don't really anticipate anything, but that statement focuses on public-private partnerships. So anytime you kind of have those joint parties coming together and or public-public partnerships. So we call them PPPs. Which I'm not sure it's a great terminology, but that's what the industry has called it. So again, we'll be working with the team to determine if there's any potential impact for the village. I mentioned 2 formal letters. We have also issued to the village what we call a SAS 114 letter. That is a required communication letter that really would outline anything like disagreements with management, where management maybe didn't agree with an accounting policy. I'm happy to report it really is the standard language. We did not have any of those types of things to disclose, obviously, so really a form letter that we have provided to the village. So I'm happy to answer any questions, but I think Nikki's got some discussion points as well. Our chair has, I can tell you have a question.
And it's silly because it doesn't apply it, but the subscription, the text apps, the app fees, the maintenance fees, et cetera. I know we spend a bunch of money on that, obviously, but you're saying there's a whole new accounting for how we spend it, or you're analyzing the contracts to find potential tech issues? What is the point of the analysis?
Really, it's so not to analyze how you spend it. Right now, any of those subscription fees, you basically expense as an operating cost. What GASB is saying is you're really purchasing an asset and making a repayment.
Good Lord, so
Yes.
leasing.
It's literally a copy
Okay.
paste. Yep.
Thank you.
And I keep going to meetings and saying, please, I'm just the messenger, so. It is one I wrote back to GASB, our firm did, many firms did, and said, we're now entering kind of a little bit of insanity, so. Yes.
Without getting too far into it, I think the monster that we have to account for is our new ERP system.
Yes.
Because we do have, it's hosted, it's software as a service, so that would be.
And material, obviously.
Materials for the general
Yes.
fund.
And so semantics, really.
Fun.
Okay, got it. I'm sorry, you.
No, that's
you had-
great.
Oh, no, that's really all we had to share, so I thank you very much for
Thank
the
you.
summary. And we're happy to answer any questions about the results. One thing I would add to Jamie's comments, and we might touch on this when we get into the actuarial report, is that there was a rather significant market value adjustment in the pension fund. We talked a little bit about this in the memo for this evening, but then also the memo for Thursday night. As part of the statewide consolidation of investments, the village was required to transfer all of our pension portfolio investments over to the consolidated board. We did so by the end of June, which was what was required. And then when the state board took over, we transferred those assets in kind, and then they started to reallocate those assets. So a lot of them were liquidated, but they were also valued, revalued, I guess, independently valued.
Independently valued.
So as part of that, most funds in Illinois, and you can speak to this more than I can, all took a large hit on their market value. One caveat that I would say is that market value assessments are a point in time, it's a day in the market. It's not the end all be all of the health of our pension fund. You'll see this as we start talking about the actuarial report, that our funding level is about the same. It really hasn't moved that much as a result of this. And it won't impact our actuarial contribution as much this year. Again, I don't want to steal your thunder there, but we will have some smoothing that will take place in accordance with our pension funding policy. So we won't see a sharp spike in our increases or in our contributions because of this. But I did want to just note that, because if you are looking at the financials for the pension funds, you'll notice that market value dropped off quite a bit.
Yeah, and I think unfortunately, any December year-end clients were really hit hard. And to Nikki's point, it's really valuing as of exactly that date. So some of our more recent fiscal year ends, like in April, aren't seeing that significant. And markets have rebounded a bit. Yeah.
Yes, and you just hit on it, and I'm sorry, I neglected to say that. Part of that too was the crazy market conditions last year. And
Hey, Nikki, can I ask a question real quick?
Sure, please.
So it was our bonds that revalued, right? Because public equities are priced every day. So it was the bond portfolio that's less liquid, less frequently traded. I'm assuming where all the villages took hits.
Correct. What we do from a financial standpoint, value at market value once a year. So that's part of it too.
Hopefully if markets continue they are, will get a kick up in this year. And part of it, you're saying is, okay, so they had to, after they consolidated, you turn over in kind, they then liquidate some of, or all of it, and then reinvest it. So to the extent rates have gone up, prices have gone down, you take the hit that you're talking about, but you're also now getting a higher rate of return, refilling the coffers. So, I mean, it's,
Yes, now is not a bad time to reinvest in the market.
yeah, it's,
Right,
it's taking a dollar and just saying, you actually did take a loss because the market was down, whether you recognize it or not. But in this case, we actually had to recognize it. It was sitting there regardless.
Yeah, I think you would have had similar impact regardless of if you transferred assets or
Yeah.
not. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for all that.
Thank you very much. Any other questions on the audit or the process?
Thank you for having us.
Welcome to say that you don't have to.
Thanks.
Thank you. Good to see you all.
You too.
Okay, so moving on down the line. So I'd like to introduce Heidi Enderfer, who's with Foster and Foster, who is our consulting actuary. And then, make sure I get your last name right. Luke Schoenhofen as well, who's from Foster and Foster. Well, I'll let you introduce him, but just before we get into that snapshot and a quick background on our actuarial report. So as we just talked about, our actuarial evaluation is very closely tied to our annual audit process. Each year, the village engages with Foster and Foster to conduct a comprehensive analysis of our fund. And that ultimately ends in what is important to this finance committee and to the village board as a whole, what our required contribution will be to the pension funds. We will spend the majority of our time tonight on the police pension fund because that's where all the activity and all the fun is. But I will just note that on the fire pension side, just as a reminder, we have one remaining beneficiary in that fund. So we are just funding on a pay-as-you-go basis for the remainder of that annuity. So that contribution is really frozen where it is in time. As we mentioned, slight change in the value of our assets, and Heidi will go over actuarial value versus market value. But we did miss our investment target. Just a reminder, we are still targeting 6.5%. And our investments came in at 3.55 on an actuarial basis, right? We talked about the market loss consolidation. What we will be looking at in terms of a required contribution for this coming budget year. So this will be for the 2024 budget year of what we would include in the levy calculation for this December. It's just over $2.7 million, which is up from this year of 2.6. So at this point, I will turn it over to Heidi to go through the report. And if you haven't grabbed one already, there are copies of the report in the center of the table.
So it'll be the one that reads police pension fund, but I believe Nikki did bring a few copies of the fire if anybody was curious. I won't be focusing on that tonight because while GASB is in the back of that report and it is required to go through those numbers for the accountants, and they do appear in that report that we just went over. It's not, it's pay as you go. There's one participant, she's 92 years old, and so we don't know how long you'll be paying that annuity. Tomorrow I'm going to Cleveland to visit my 99-year-old grandmother, so who knows? Anyway, so I'm here tonight with my colleague Schoenhofen, and he recently became a fellow of the Society of Actuaries, which I'm as well. Although I did this many years ago because I'm much older than Luke, but he basically means he gave up his 20s to study for exams instead of having fun, which I also did. So that is why we are here tonight. As a recent fellow of the Society of Actuaries, Luke will be delivering reports like this in meetings. So he's sort of shadowing us at a few meetings before we send him off on his own solo to do this. And so in the future, you may see me, you may see Luke, who knows? So that's what, and he was integral in producing these numbers as well. So he is familiar with all of your numbers here in the report too. So And congratulations on your exam success. Okay, so with that, everybody should have a copy of that police pension report in front of them, and we are going to start on page 5 of that report. So that report, this is the summary report page. Bottom line on top, we'll leave with that. So the right-hand column will show you last year's numbers for comparison. The leftmost column will be this year's numbers. The first thing to point out here is the village recommended contribution went up. It basically was 2.66 million, went up to 2.72 million. That's about a 2.1% increase year over year. That happened for several reasons. A lot of that was due to the assets that we did discuss, but there was some other unfavorable experience in the fund related to some of the demographics as well. So you had more retirements than expected. That's not uncommon these days. A lot of police funds are seeing higher retirement experience than had previously been anticipated. We have trued up those retirement rate tables to hopefully reflect that better in the future. But we did see more retirements than expected. You did have a disablement this year. Anytime you have a disablement happen, that will increase the liability in the years of those disablements. Obviously, everything happens on a discrete basis in real life, but in our valuations, we assume a tiny percentage of every active becomes disabled every year. So in the years where there's no disablements, there's actually gains for that decrement. When it happens, there is a loss, though. So we did see a couple of things like that happen as well. So I'm going to turn to page 6 because in addition to some of that gain loss experience, we did make a number of assumption changes this year. And this just really relates to a study that was done on the Consolidated Police Pension Fund. If you recall, previous to the consolidated funds, you were receiving an actual report from the state. That responsibility has simply shifted over to consolidated funds. Similarly, the state of Illinois used to do periodic experience studies of all of the police funds across the whole state of Illinois. So they take the experience of all the funds across the state of Illinois and figure out what the retirement decrements, disability decrements, all of those were based on actual experience. Now, there's not many given funds that are large enough to have their own studies done. If we look at your population of 26 actives, there just wouldn't be enough retirements or disablements at any given age to build a full table out. So we do rely heavily on these consolidated studies because they take all of that Article 3 experience and consolidate that for a better perspective on what that looks like. So we did make updates based on that study that was done for the Illinois Police Officers Pension Fund. That included updates to all of the decrements: mortality, retirement, disability, termination rates. Mortality was relatively minor, but it was a shift in the methodology. We'll get into a little bit in the assumptions a bit. Retirement was the biggest one here. So retirement, we did see earlier retirements than we had been seeing previously, and that was now reflected in these tables. So earlier retirements generally mean higher liabilities because we're starting that annuity a little bit sooner than anticipated. So that is reflected here. We updated salary increases. Those were minor adjustments based on more recent experience. And then the payroll growth assumption based on your funding policy, we are phasing down to a 2.5% level. So if you recall, last year we changed the methodology to move to a full 15-year rolling methodology. And part of that change in the funding policy was also grading down this payroll growth assumption. So every year we're bringing that down another 25 basis points. The result of reducing that assumption is actually increasing your payments this year. And we'll get into that as well. I have some numbers to detail the impact of that. With that, let's turn to page 7 of the report. So on page 7, this is the comparative summary of potential valuation results. This is the very first page, lots of numbers here. We have 3 sections of this report. Section A, or on this page. Section A is participant data. This is the information we received from you guys to perform the valuation. Section B will detail the assets, and then section C is where we get into the actual calculations and liability. There are 3 columns here now. So again, that rightmost column is last year's numbers. The middle column will show you what the numbers would have been had we not implemented any of those assumption changes that I just talked about. So you can see the impact of those changes on the valuation. And then the leftmost column will give you the final numbers and what we'll be basing the contribution on this year. So if we focus on section A at the top, that participant data, you can see that there was several changes year over year here. Especially for a fund year size, we did see a lot of movement happen. We see that the actives reduced from 30 down to 26. That happened due to 4 retirements, 1 disablement, 2 terminations, and then those were replaced by 3 new hires. One important thing to note in your fund, and I guess I'd like a little bit of feedback on this one, is every year we've seen this number come down. So when we were here in 2021, that number was 35. We're down to 26 now. Is the intention to hold stable at that? Is there a budgeted number?
Our intention is to get back up to full staff.
Which is
Okay.
36.
36, okay, so just to note that. Okay, so what'll happen as you increase to those 36 is you'll increase the normal cost, so that annual cost of accruing pension benefits will go up as you add those headcounts. But we have been seeing that come down, which has actually helped your contribution, mitigates it a little bit, that you're not adding additional costs for those new accruals. So that's section A at the top. Section B is the asset value. And Nikki had mentioned we do perform a 5-year smoothing method on the assets. So this is pretty standard in the actuarial world to smooth the asset value, because when we're delivering contributions, we don't want to introduce significant volatility to those numbers year over year. These are budgeted numbers typically, and anytime you're talking about budgets, volatility is usually a very bad word. So the idea is that we smooth any gains or losses over a 5-year period. So a gain would be anything that earns higher than our assumed return of 6.5%. A loss is anything that assumes less than 6.5%. So if we look at last year's column here, and you look at the ratio of the actuarial value to the market value, you can see that the actuarial value was actually lower than market value last year. That suggests that we actually had deferred gains last year. So the the ratio here was 0.97. That means that you had deferred gains on the books. So assets had actually been performing better historically than our 6.5%. That situation has reversed this year. So we have one year experience to reverse that. Now actuarial value leads market value. And so that ratio is 1.13. Go ahead, sorry.
I get the concept of smoothing gains and losses. What's your starting point? History going back 100 years or?
So at some point we marked to market. I believe in your fund it was in 2011 that we marked to market, which means that actual value and market value equal each other. And then from then on, we start measuring that gain.
You're talking about the net aggregate differences over 11, 12 years.
Well, at the point, but it's a 5-year smoothing. So after 5 years, it's fully rolled into that asset. So it's really only a 5-year.
Okay, so it's 5.
And that's one of those things too. Often when we're talking about funding policy, it's not uncommon to talk about let's mark to market again and reset. This is how we would be asking you that question. Would be the ideal point in time. Not that we want to cherry pick, but we certainly don't want to do the opposite either, which would have happened this year. And go ahead.
I'm sorry.
And we typically don't, we don't reset to market very often. If actual value market starts to deviate too much, we may suggest that, but we're not in that position.
And so if it's 5 years smoothing, then would there be, if you knew that your rate of return was going to hit exactly your projected 6.5 or theoretical 6.5, then would you also know what the actuarial value was going to be based on the so far unsmooth? In other words, is there a bank of gains or losses that are yet to happen if you wrote the projections?
There are.
Page 25.
Yep.
Oh, okay.
So you can actually see that there is a chart in the middle of page 25. And I usually don't get into this much detail because it is pretty
Sorry.
granular, but no, I appreciate the question and most people just aren't that curious. So I think it's pretty cool though.
Well, most people have a life.
I'm an actuary, you're talking about it. Anyway, so that chart in the middle here will show you by year the deferral that will be happening. And you can see right now it is generally losses that are going to be reflected.
Yep.
But that could reverse next year. And you can see a couple of years ago,
Right.
at the end of 2020, we were talking about pretty significant.
Okay,
Hopefully,
that's
same
very
thing
helpful.
next year.
Thank you.
Okay, so that's section B, and then the third section here is section C. So this is the present value benefit calculation. It's the very first calculation we perform as actuaries. And basically that number at the bottom of that leftmost column, that $78.5 million number, represents the amount of assets that you would need to have in the fund today if you wanted to be fully funded on those 79 people and not contribute anymore, and all of my assumptions come true, which is kind of a big hand. But if that was true, and you had $78.5 million in the fund, you'd be fully funded. Nobody would fund to that number because those actives are still earning those benefits. So on page 8, we actually split that up. So on page 8, we split that into the benefits that have already been earned. And then we have a category called present value future normal costs for future earnings that we anticipate that are already built into that present value benefits number on page 7. And so if we look at the total actual accrued liability, that $70.8 million number near the bottom of that leftmost column, that's the accrued liability based on service that's already been earned. So this is your funding bogey. This is what you want your assets to equal. You'd be fully funded if you had that amount of assets in the fund. Obviously, most funds in Illinois certainly are not in that position. So we do compare that to the actual value of assets, the smooth numbers to mitigate that volatility again. And that gives us the unfunded actual accrued liabilities. So that's the service earned and not yet paid for. It's effectively a mortgage that the village has on past accruals in the fund. That's the $28.0 million number. So that'll be a significant part of your contribution, and we'll look at that in a couple of pages here. That gives us a funded ratio of 60.4%. You can see that did come down a little bit from last year. As I said, hopefully I'm coming to you with better news next year, but this wasn't unanticipated. You know, everybody kind of knows how the market went. Most people's 401ks probably went similar directions. So understanding, you know, the markets are volatile, and that's why we smooth. The other number I want to point out on this page is near the middle of that column. So that's the total normal cost of $787,844. That number is representative of the cost of your 26 actives to earn 1 year of pension benefits in the fund. So for just working 1 more year and earning 1 more year of benefits towards retirement, that cost is $787,844. We look at page 10 now. We'll roll all of that information up into the numbers that you probably care about most, which is the contribution. So section E here at the top details all of those components that go into the contribution. Now on this page, we have applied interest to all of the numbers I just talked about because they aren't paid on the valuation date of January 1st, they're paid later in the year. And so we do apply interest here. So we have line item 1 normal cost, $839,000. Add to that the administrative expenses of about $26,000. And then if we were to subtract from that the expected member contributions, because remember the members themselves are contributing 9.91% of salary towards their own retirement benefits. That's an offset to that normal cost number that, you know, they contributed annually out of payroll. And that offset is that $315,000 near the bottom of that column. That would be your annual contribution if you're fully funded. So as I mentioned, you do have that mortgage on that unfunded accrued liability, and that's the number in the very middle of that section, the $2.2 million number. That is now being amortized over an 18-year period. As I mentioned earlier, we did adopt, you have a funding cost that you did adopt a 15-year open rolling amortization. The way that you're going to achieve that is you're going to phase down to it. So next year I'll come to you with a 17-year amortization, then 16, and once we get to 15, we're sticking at 15. So that will start to, spread that cost out over 15 years every year. So that you'll start to see the cost stabilize a bit. That's about 80% though of your recommended contribution, $2.7 million is just to sort of catch up to those past bills, that mortgage. So eventually that goes away, it takes a long time, and with the rolling amortization, it will slow that process a little bit. The next section I like to look at here is section F. This is the contribution that actually happened last year relative to the recommended amount. So the village recommendation was $2,456,792. The village actually contributed $2,531,11. 103% of the recommended amount. That's healthy to see. The numbers here are being taken seriously, and that will be in continued progress towards paying off that unfunded. So that's always a healthy thing to see. So on page 11, section H at the top illustrates for us what that amortization will look like. So this is the projected unfunded accrued liability over time. You'll notice that in 2041, it is not paid off because you are moving to that open amortization. So we're still only amortizing, over that 15-year period at that point in time. But it is reduced from the 28 million down to about 19 million. And then if we look at I'm going to look at section I2 just because we did talk about the market value of assets so much and how much of a hit that took last year. You can see here historically, if you look at the actual market value in that very first column at the bottom, it is quite volatile. That you see numbers that are, quite low, quite high, and it does bounce up and down. The middle column there shows you what the smooth value looks like. It's still a little bit volatile, but it's much less volatile, and that's the impact of the 5-year smooth, so that you can see why we do this here. Okay, so on page 12, this is the development of the amortization payments, so the calculation of that mortgage payment basically on the unfunded. On page 12 here, in the very bottom right-hand corner, you can see a number of about $2 million that's amortized over an 18-year period. We are now at the 3% payroll growth assumption. We're phasing down to 2.5. If we had jumped to the 2.5 immediately instead of phased to that $2,037,099 number would go up to $2,113,000. About a $76,000 increase with interest, close to $80,000 increase in the contribution. So it is a little bit painful to move that quickly, but that's why we're doing a phase down approach. Okay, so on page 14, this is the reconciliation of changes in the contribution requirement. So what this page shows us is what impacted the contribution year over year, what line items here changed things. So item 1 at the top is last year's recommendation, item 3 at the bottom is this year's, and you can see the various components here that contributed to the increase and or decrease. You had a couple significant decreases here that were offset by some of that experience that we've been talking about. Specifically, the top item here, change in normal cost, that's simply a decrease in your headcount. So you move from 30 to 26, you just have less people accruing benefits. So that situation may reverse in the future, but it is important to note that that's been saving you money each year. The change in assumed administrative expenses, this was kind of a one-year fluke. Last year you had sort of a strange settlement that happened and was included in administrative expenses. That went away. And now we're back to kind of a normal administrative expense annually. And so that contributed to the decrease as well. We basically fund administrative expenses on a pay-as-you-go system. So whatever they were last year, we just assume they'll be the same again this year. And then you can see in the middle here, there's several items that show you the impact of the various gains and losses, generally losses in this situation. As I mentioned, investment return contributed $94,000 to the increase. The fact that you had more retirements than expected contributed about $98,000. So you have some of those line items in here. The increase in the amortization payment due to the payroll growth assumption was about $60,000. That's going to be a number you will see annually. So if all of my assumptions come true, you can anticipate a number about $60,000 higher next year just by the nature of using that payroll growth assumption. And then we did have those assumption changes that we did implement year over year, which increased things about $38,000. So relatively minor compared to some of these other items, but noteworthy as well. So we look at page 15. This is the projection of benefit payment. So going back to that very first liability number that I showed you of about $78 million, I basically take that number and I break down what the benefit payment stream that supports that number would look like. So this is based on a closed population of the folks that are in the population today. If I focus on that 2023 row and I look at the total payments of about $4 million and compare that to your market value of assets, it's about 11% of your assets at this point in time. Obviously, market went down significantly, so that's higher. Hopefully next year I can come to you and say it's more like 7% of your assets or something like that, but we'll see where assets go. So it's a little bit higher as a percentage of your assets at this point in time. It gets you thinking about things like liquidity and how long your assets are going to be able to work for you to help offset some of that cost. Page 16 through 18 just show you a summary of the assumptions that we used here for the valuation. A couple ones I want to point out. The interest rate is 6.5%. This is a relatively conservative interest rate. We are very comfortable with this rate because of conservatism. Actuaries like to be conservative, but it's worth noting that the IPAPA fund is using 6.8%. So when you get your reports from the consolidated fund, we'll be using a higher interest rate. We're taking a wait and see approach on this. We'll talk about funding policy in a few years again, if that needs to be refreshed at that point in time. But right now, while consolidation is happening, we know that there's a lot of liquidation and reinvestment. We're moving from passive to active management. That's happening over the next 3 to 5 years. 6.5% is a pretty good place to sit, I think, while we're waiting for that to sort of go down. The next thing I want to point out is the mortality here. As I mentioned, we did make adjustments to mortality tables. While they didn't impact the liability that much, the way we're handling mortality here is very different now. for using what's called generational mortality. So in the past, we were just taking our mortality tables, projecting them 5 years past the valuation date for mortality improvement as people are living longer each year. Instead, now we're implementing what's called generational mortality, which means every birth year has slightly better mortality than the birth year prior to that. So somebody born in 1980 is going to not live quite as long as somebody born in 1981, who's not going to live quite as long as somebody born in 1982, and that's called generational mortality. That's what we're implementing now. It's just a little bit more accurate way to reflect mortality in your reports, and it is sort of the direction the actual world's been going. So we updated your reports to reflect that as well. The other tables we had already discussed, so I'm going to flip you all the way down to page 27. Page 27 just shows you the statistical data that we use for form evaluations. So focusing again on that leftmost column, we do show you your active split by tier, so tier 1 versus tier 2. Your fund at this point in time is at 58%. I know, Nikki, you mentioned that you did have some lateral movement come in, so you weren't replacing some of those tier 1 folks with tier 2 folks maybe as quickly as you had anticipated or some other funds are. But as those folks start to retire out, you will only be able to replace them with tier 2 folks, and tier 2 folks do earn at a lower rate than tier 1, have lower normal costs, and therefore a lower cost overall. Looking at your retirees, their average age of 65 is pretty typical. Similarly with your beneficiaries, 75 is relatively typical. Your disabled are a little bit older at 61. And just the last thing I want to point out is you have 7 terminated vested listed here. Only 3 of those are really due future annuities from your fund. 4 of them are simply due a refund of their contributions should they come ask for them. Those contributions sit in your fund until they do ask for them. They don't earn any interest on them, you do. So it's not hurting the fund in any way to leave them sit there. So on page 28, this is an age and service distribution of your active population. So we see age in buckets along the left-hand side, service across the top. If we focus on the right-hand corner of that page and look at anybody with more than 20 years of service who's over age 50, we have 3 folks that fall into that category. So that tells me as of the valuation date, only 3 people were eligible to retire. If I back that off 5 years and I look at anybody over 15 years of service, over age 45, I don't add anybody. So in the next 5 years, only 3 people could retire from your fund. We've seen a lot of retirement activity here already, so there's just not a lot left still to happen. That's good news for the fund. We won't see those benefit payments pick up too quickly, and again, your money has more time to work for you. And the very last page I want to point out to you is on page 30. There is a 3-page summary here of Article 3. This doesn't replace Article 3, but it is a much quicker reference if you did have questions about disabled benefits, tier 1 versus tier 2 benefits on any given area, those kind of questions. This would be a quick reference. The back of the report does have, there's more pages here related to GASB. This really has to do with the report you already covered regarding the annual financial report. Those numbers basically appear in here. The big differences here when you're looking at GASB are I don't get to smooth anything when I do GASB. Accountants don't like smoothing, they like market value. So that's all market value numbers in here. And so you'll see volatile numbers here. So your funded status drops really significantly in this report just because of the nature of how these calculations have to be measured. And then ultimately they have us calculated expense, which again will show more volatility just by the nature of not smooth. So with that, are there any questions about the report?
I have a question.
Sure.
When someone transfers in, do they transfer their benefits as well?
They can. So
Or
what?
is that negotiable?
So there's actually, it's in the legislation, in the code on how that transfer works. So generally speaking, so say somebody transfers from another police fund, they have the option of what we call a buyback. So the idea is the buyback is they have to keep the fund whole, meaning that there should be no additional unfunded liability that comes over when they bring that service over. And so there's legislation that says how the municipality that's transferring the person's service has to pay their contributions with interest and ×2, and there's a formula around that money that comes over. And then any difference in our liability that we calculate that is not covered by that transfer of those contributions, the participant themselves has to fund up. So it keeps the fund whole, is the idea. So those theoretically don't cost the fund.
So far, all of our laterals have indicated that they are transferring service. We have completed a couple of them, and we do work with Foster and Foster on that calculation. The only folks that would not be able to transfer in is if we do hire a lateral from
Chicago. Because they're a different article and they're not allowed unless there was a change in legislation. Right now, they're not able to transfer that credit in.
Occasionally, windows will open up that will allow those things to happen. And the rules might be slightly different than how it works for Article 3 to Article 3 transfers as well. It gets very complicated depending on the type of transfer, but it's typically Article 3 to Article 3.
So taking someone from Chicago, it cost us more.
It would cost us, not necessarily because they're not transferring that service credit in, so they would have to work longer in our fund.
They don't have the service
They don't get the
credit.
service credit.
It
No.
all depends on how you look at it, right? Because if you're taking an older officer, that they would, if they stay here longer, the older that they get, I'm sure mortality, disablements, the statistics are different than taking an officer right away.
With methodology, your works too is generally speaking, younger officers have a lower normal cost. So if you bring somebody over mid-career, their normal cost will be a little bit higher. It's usually not that dramatic, but it could be the difference between 15,000 and 30,000 depending on where. Any other questions? If anybody thinks of anything later, you wake up at 3 a.m. and you're like, I have to know this.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Heidi.
Appreciate it.
And you are also welcome to stay, but you don't have to. Same with you. We need a break before we get going. Okay, great. We're in the home stretch. So our last item on the agenda is a discussion concerning the donation policy. As this group likely remembers, the village board approved a donation policy last year as part of the village's financial policies. This was done to ensure proper oversight and a formal process for review and approval of any donations that the village received, whether that was in kind or a cash donation. And as you may recall from the policy, what was decided upon by the finance committee and approved by the village board was that any donation over $1,000 would come before this body for your review and acceptance before the village would accept a donation. In conjunction with this policy, last month we had a brief discussion about how this might relate to the fundraising efforts with the Friends of the Glencoe Golf Club. Now that that referendum has been approved, the Friends are obviously ramping up their fundraising efforts, and the potential for donations to occur could be a lot more frequent and a lot larger in size. So included in the packet is a redlined version of proposed changes that we're hoping to discuss with this body. When the policy was first implemented, it was designed to exclude the fundraising efforts of the Friends because they are a separate 501c3. The fundraising is done by non-employees, they're by volunteers of the Friends of the Glencoe Golf Club. But now things have changed a little bit in that we are in line to receive some rather significant donations. Also, as part of the Friends fundraising efforts, they've added the opportunity for naming rights. So these would be contributions specific to name an asset that would ultimately be owned by the village. So we do want to make sure that there's proper oversight of that as well, and that the village has the opportunity to review what's being proposed and approve or deny those donations as they come before us. So one of the first red line in the policy, we were proposing required finance committee approval. We did modify this threshold to be $25,000
We're not committed to that, but the thought process behind that was that there's going to be a number of naming opportunities, at least for the Glencoe Golf Club, that might be below that, and we're not sure, if people are donating bricks for $500, we're not sure that you want everything to come before you, or if you would like those aggregated in increments of 25,000. And then the second amendment is an effort to clarify the language of how this might apply to the Glencoe Golf Club, that we're really not trying to govern their fundraising efforts, but more so what the village will accept or deny. And that also carries with it a threshold of 25,000. So what we're looking for this evening is just your initial thoughts on the modifications that we've made to the policy. The language that is in there specific to naming rights is purposefully generic, understanding that the golf club might not be the only naming rights that we deal with in the life of this policy. This may come up in other aspects of the village operations. So at this point, unless Phil has anything to add, I'd just like to open it up to the committee for your initial feedback in terms of the modifications that we've proposed to you. Based off of the feedback we've received tonight, ultimately this policy would go before the whole village board for their review and approval as well. We just wanted to have this discussion here first.
Couple things come to mind. The program for the golf club, whatever it is, whether it's selling bricks on the cart path, naming a hole, naming a building, whatever the entire systematic approach is. Shouldn't we have, if we're going to start putting people's names on things, shouldn't we just sort of, number one, generally understand and approve the overall approach? Second, I agree on the one hand, I don't think we want to sort of have discretionary approval of small donations, although I think 25 is awfully large, but that's just my view. Third, what process do we have to vet every single name through a OFAC or other type corollary system so that we know we're not accepting money from someone we shouldn't be accepting money from?
So, take it one at a time.
Yeah.
So the existing policy that we have in place does require any formal fundraising program that's conducted by staff to come before the finance committee. So that would be like when we do sponsorships for Light the Lights, for example. And that would be, I think, particularly important for this body to review because you're in a situation where you have staff asking for money and you want to make sure that there are established guidelines for conflict of interest and what people could be contributing. The policy as it exists today does specifically exclude entities that are not part of the village. So it is kind of a fuzzy line between the Friends of the Glencoe Golf Club, which is a 501c3, and governing staff and the operations of the village. You do make a good point in that the Friends of the Glencoe Golf Club solely exist to fundraise for this purpose, and therefore that is why we're having this discussion, right? Because ultimately those funds would be donated to the village and the village will accept or deny those. It would be in our best interest, I think, pending the feedback from the rest of the committee, to have a discussion about what the fundraising program is, what the plan is, and what this committee would like to approve or deny at what threshold. And that kind of goes to your $25,000 question, is that too large or too little? What process do we have in terms of, what was the last thing? In terms of
Well, yeah, sorry, just,
vetting names.
if you've
So-
got the name of someone that was on a no-fly terrorist list, to give the extraordinary
Kaczynski.
example.
So right now,
Yeah.
the items that we have where our policy focuses on defining an acceptable donation is really centered around whether or not an individual is lobbying the village for any type of activity. So if they're trying to get something done on their property, if they're trying to get an ordinance passed, or they have an active building permit and they're working through a process. Also, if there's just any conflict of interest or anyone that's officially registered as a lobbyist down in Springfield. So really, what we tried to outline in the policy was to focus on a clear white line of what would be a conflict of interest in accepting that money. Where I think you might be headed, and stop me if I'm wrong, is having a larger discussion about what groups might be appropriate or not appropriate for the village to accept above and beyond a clear, defined conflict of interest.
And I'm not trying to expand that, except to the extent perhaps there are legalities, or just even if it's not illegal for us to take a contribution from a known terrorist, we shouldn't. I don't think anybody, I'm assuming the board wouldn't want to. But I think that's something we should think about in terms of tweaking policy, and those kinds of things are easy to run checks. And again, I'm not talking about their family. They could have lovely family members, et cetera, but I'm actually talking about people on a government list.
And we could add, that is actually a common element because as part of this process, we have been researching donation policies of other nonprofit agencies. We've taken a look at the Park District policy. And there are provisions in other policies to include a legal review. And I think it's not unreasonable to add a suggested revision to the policy to make sure that part of the finance committee's due diligence to consult with an attorney and make sure that we are fully vetting any donors.
I guess a question for that is, and I don't, now that I'm going to say it out loud, it sounds weird. Is there a threshold where that is done at a higher level versus something
Dollar
else?
threshold?
Right.
Yes,
I don't
there
know.
is.
There you go.
I mean, do we want to do OFAC checks on $100 gifts? I mean,
That's
right.
kind of my
Yeah,
question,
no,
right?
I agree.
But how about this too? We should have a policy where, let's say that something is missed or something changes, and we no longer want, so and so's name on something. We could have the right to take it down at our discretion if we have some, what if we had the Jeffrey Epstein golf, building, and then, we got money 20 years ago. Well, we might want the right to change that now. So, I mean, there's got to be some way for us to write some language that gives us an ability to revise if something happens. So,
To that point, Trustee Hallwix, and I don't mean to cut you off, I think another component of it is that naming isn't necessarily forever either. There are provisions within many policies that allow for naming to be for a specific period of time.
We do have that in the recommended language. We're recommending that the naming right would be limited to the life of that asset. The thought process being, if that asset needs to be replaced and we need to fundraise again, we would open that opportunity to anyone.
Exactly.
But the building as a whole, for example, to go to Joe's comment,
You still want to
Yeah.
outclause potentially.
because the building might get updated, but until you bulldoze it, you're not replacing it.
So, look, when I grew up, the Northwestern Stadium was Dyke Stadium. And then it was Welsh Ryan, and, so we can learn when we start, and we hope we get big contributions, and then we can talk to folks, figure out, okay, what's a reasonable period? And I don't know, you can, I don't know if we'll get any donations if we have the right to say after we get the money, oh yeah, sorry, not you, but thanks for the money. We won't get any donations, so we're gonna have to figure out how that works. Something was applied to the Sacklers, who, you know, they had a perfectly lovely business and they were making everybody happy. And everybody was happy to take their money, and then all of a sudden said, oh, that's not such a great business, and we're happy to keep your money, but we don't want your name anymore. But that's messy. By the way, we are dealing with a golf club. So suppose, in honor of their merger, LIV said, we happen to have an extra 15 mil, which we would like to drop on Stella Nanos because she's lovely and she's done a great job with Glencoe here. What do we do?
It's romantic.
And, you know, a lot of me would want to say, you know,
And I would also say, I think when we think about timelines for naming, it doesn't necessarily have to be the life of the asset. And I think that's how the stadium gets renamed multiple times, is that there is a time frame. I've seen that, I've seen that component, whether it's 20 years or it's a lengthy period of time, but it isn't forever, and it isn't necessarily the life of the asset, because it's somewhere in between. Because again, just because the building stands for 100 years doesn't mean you leave it there for 100 years. You're going to invest in it. Things are going to happen. You're going to have to, have significant renovations that take place over time, and you want that ability to have some flexibility.
we want advice from fundraisers. And we have, of course, we've got a series, unfortunately, but we've got fundraisers who can tell us, if you say it's 5 years, you're going to get this. If you say it's 30 for some big amount, you're going to get more, and then we'll have to decide what we want to do.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
And while the dollar threshold, certainly on the low side, is certainly, we don't want it to be burdensome. But again, it's not just the dollar amount, it's the nature of the asset. Somebody gave us $24,000 and they wanted to name the building. And that was the best we could do. We might still say no, thank you.
Right.
We'll leave it unnamed.
And
So
then-
I want to,
Well, I
we just need to
I do
be sensible.
I do
That's
think as we come to a point where there's a level of comfort, there does need to be a formal discussion between this body, perhaps the full village board, and the Friends of the Glencoe Golf Club, because they are going to engage further fundraising support. They need to know what you're comfortable with.
Right.
And we can have the policy, right? But to your point, the policy may be this, and somebody says, yeah, but I'll give you this. The village should still have the right of refusal. At those types of levels where you talk about naming, or you talk about some sort of significant attachment of something to something, as opposed to, I'm going to write you a $5,000 check, and in return, a bench will be placed on the 5th hole, right?
Right.
Or you have a plaque on a donation wall.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
And I agree with that completely. In fact, it's almost like, do we really want to make this policy change or suggest the policy change immediately until we become a little more informed, to the village president's point, as to what makes sense? And that might also be after we've talked with the Friends and the fund, and then come up with something, this sounds like a reasonable plan. And by the way, go and be well, unless we have a technical legal issue to check on at a reasonable dollar amount, we won't step in on that above these things, and there'll be some major assets that we have to say yes to because it'll be on such a large display.
I hope, by the way, that we could sell the building, rooms in the building, all kinds of stuff. Because that's what's done.
Yeah.
That's what, there's the thus and such gallery and thus and such room and, whatever.
Listen, when we moved here 30 some odd years ago, the first thing we wound up doing was getting, our kids are at the park around the corner. And so the name is there because of course we're going to contribute. We're going there every day with the kids, right? As did many, many, many others. So, sure.
Have we provided any help?
Yes, I think we may have another comment as well.
Please.
I have a good question about the last sentence. It says that a donation of 25,000 from the FGGC. Should that be maybe clarified to say from like one person or entity on behalf of the, because it sounds like, I don't know, do we want to get every $100, like
Right.
a transfer from the FGGC to, it reads more like they're giving it to us, or it could be a lump sum, a bunch of smaller amounts, so maybe just try to clarify.
It is. I think we do need to clarify that. It's a good point. I think what we had talked about in terms of logistics of receiving donations from the Friends of Glencoe Golf Club is that they would make donations in a lump sum for specific projects. So understanding that we have an intergovernmental agreement that the village board approved for the Friends to reimburse the village for all expenses related to the croquet court construction. That won't come to us in the form of a bunch of $5,000 deposits. It will come as a check from the Friends in the amount of $50,000 or whatever it is. So that was kind of the thought process here, is that the money's not coming directly from Gary Rubin to the village. It's funneling through the Friends. So as much as I think we need to clarify that, we also need to have a discussion with the board or with the finance committee and with the board of when we do that, do you want a list of the underlying donations? Or what is that threshold of if within that $50,000, is it all made up of $1,000 brick donations? Or is there a $45,000 donation from someone specifically that's making up the majority of that dollar amount that may be a problem?
And again, I would, all of this is, listen, we're a governmental agency. This committee is in government, so we have to be cognizant of that. The odds of a problem occurring, I want to just say it for the record, are so slim to nil. But, the lawyer in me requires that we consider.
And you don't know until you get there.
Right,
And
right.
it's in our best interest to plan for that ahead of time.
Well, and there may be ways, and we can explore this a little bit more too. There may be ways as donations are aggregated, there's a donor list that's submitted from the Friends that articulates, the purpose, perhaps at a threshold, again, to not every $100 brick, but, if it's over a certain threshold for a certain purpose, before those funds are actually received by the Friends, there's a donor list that's shared that is reviewed.
Right.
And so that there's no awkward, we have to write a check back to somebody because they've made a donation. There's a process of accepting that goes into place.
No, your point's very well taken because at the end of the day, I'm sure everybody wants to making donations as painless and as welcome and as easy as humanly possible.
For sure. Yeah.
We want to encourage it and have no procedures to discourage it.
Yeah.
So whatever we can do within bounds, is what we want to do.
And I will say, the Friends have already begun to receive rather large donations. They aren't tied to something necessarily in terms of a naming right, but there are, multi-$1,000 donations that have made their way to the Friends. Many of those funds are being held by them. They haven't committed them to any specific purpose yet, but they're already in this process. So I do think getting to a place where there is comfort with whatever programmatic structure that they put forward before they start actually advertising that is critically important so that this body feels comfortable, they understand what they're responsible to do, and then both sides can feel comfortable that something good is going to come from this. I know the Friends are working to secure a fundraising consultant. From what I know of that fundraising consultant, I think this is going to be a fairly typical set of expectations. So I think the next step may be a conversation with that group and this group to kind of say, what's your plan? How do you propose to do this? And let's build a policy based off of being advised of that. I do think it's a good point not to put the cart necessarily before the horse on this.
By the way, this, I don't know if this is for the Friends or the village, but there are some, a lot of folks have donated. Some big, some small, but all welcome and appreciated. And I hope we will try to recognize everybody. And that if somebody's made a huge donation before we started saying we're naming stuff after people, we should try to look back and say, you too. So that nobody feels that they've been dissed.
Right, sure. That's a good point.
I'd like to add that there's probably some urgency in this. I mean, we don't want to carry this into next year or something like that. I mean, they're out there doing this right now.
Yes.
The other thing I might add is the Botanic Garden might be a good resource for that. We've done some things with our family with them.
And what we're finding is there will be a need for some discretion built in somewhere. So we will try our best as we work through this process to give the committee and the village board that flexibility that you need, while still trying to make this an easy process.
There are not going to be a lot of conflicts. There aren't. It's, I'm going to give you 50,000, but you have to waive my train station parking ticket. Okay.
Yeah. Good point.
They're just, it's just, we don't have, this is not the city of Chicago. We don't have the big money graft opportunities here.
You plan for the worst and expect the best. That's in many ways how we've structured many of our policies over time, but the point is well taken. Okay.
Yeah, the best approach is you've got all the policy and then nobody ever has to look at it.
And that is our hope. That was kind of
Sits in
the
a drawer.
hope of incorporating
Because
the
it doesn't
naming
come up.
rights in a generic frame so that we have this if it comes up with something else. So I think we have the direction we need. It sounds like we need to work on a joint meeting, and then we can work on a policy that fits the understanding of the committee after that fact.
Question, do you know what, how the Park District, what they received to get the name on Jacobs Center? What was that?
$1 million is my understanding.
That is our.
But that's 20 years, that was 20 years ago also.
$5 million.
And there are.
They look back and think it was way too cheap, and that's the problem.
Yeah.
And that is a good question, and I'm sure a fundraising consultant will have all the ideas of us of where the threshold needs to be. But I did have a conversation with the Lake Forest Golf Club, what is the name of that club? Deer Path. And they just recently named their clubhouse, and they have a stigma or a guideline in their policy that says that to name an asset of that magnitude, you must contribute at least half of the cost of the asset, which is a large dollar amount. But when I pressed them on that a little bit, they did say that there is discretion in that number. So if they are the potential recipient of an angel donation, that would be a large donation that would really kick off a larger fundraising campaign, that they do have discretion in their policy to determine what would be appropriate from
Mhm.
that standpoint.
Okay.
Questions?
No, and thank you for working on all that. Thanks.
So this will come back before the committee.
And again, to the point well made about timeliness to the extent that things need to be done faster than a monthly meeting, and you can get a special meeting together.
Understood.
That's helpful.
Yeah, I agree, Gary, because I feel like we might not have given enough direction tonight, but I don't want to interrupt the Friends fundraising, so if they need to get us on the line.
Right.
Yeah, I think.
I'm in
the next-
Orlando. We can all meet on Zoom anytime.
Sure. I think what would be useful is for us to connect with the Friends leadership and talk a little bit about how to get the conversation between the two groups scheduled.
That concludes our prepared comments. I think your next item is other items.
I was gonna say, is there anything anybody else would like to raise or comment? All right, in that case, I think I need a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
All right, motion second, all those in favor, aye.
Aye.
Thank you all very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Appreciate your
Coming
time.
first meeting.
Thanks, Joe.
Congratulations.
See you all.
New chair.
I'm